In the spring of 1906, doctors across the American South began seeing a terrifying new disease. It started with a rash on the hands and the neck, raw and red, as if the skin had been scorched by the sun. Then came the stomach pains, the relentless diarrhea, and in the worst cases, confusion, madness, and death. They called it pellagra. Over the next few decades, it would strike millions of Americans and kill tens of thousands of them, most of them poor. The doctors were baffled. Some were sure it was an infection. Some blamed flies or spoiled food. They were all wrong. The cause was sitting on the dinner table of almost every victim. It was corn. The most important grain in the Americas, the crop that had fed great civilizations for thousands of years, was quietly killing people. Not because corn is poisonous, but because the people eating it had thrown away a secret that indigenous Americans had understood for thousands of years. How did a sacred grain become a silent plague, and then go on to become the cheapest and most powerful crop on Earth? To understand that, we have to go back 9,000 years to a wild grass in Mexico that looked nothing like corn at all. Our story begins in the highlands of southern Mexico, in the valley of the Balsas River. Growing there was a scraggly wild grass called teosinte. If you saw it today, you would never guess what it would become. A teosinte ear is tiny, just a few hard kernels locked inside a casing like little stones. You could not make a meal of it. It was barely food at all. And yet, over thousands of years, the indigenous farmers of Mexico performed one of the most astonishing feats in the history of life on Earth. Generation after generation, they chose the rare plants with larger, softer kernels, and they replanted them. Slowly, painstakingly, they reshaped that useless grass into maize. They did it without microscopes, without the word genetics, with nothing but patience and observation. It was genetic engineering carried out by hand over 100 lifetimes, and in the process, they created a plant that can no longer survive on its own. The kernels of corn are locked onto a cob and sealed inside a husk. If an ear falls to the ground, the seedlings sprout in a tangled clump and choke one another. Corn cannot scatter its own seed. Like the banana, it depends on human hands completely. We did not just grow corn, we invented it. Maize became the foundation of the great civilizations of the Americas. The Olmec, the Maya, and the Aztec all rose on its harvests, and to them it was far more than food. It was sacred. In the Maya book of creation, the gods tried to make human beings out of mud and then out of wood, and both attempts fail. Only when they form people out of maize dough do humans finally come to life. To the Maya, we were not just fed by corn. We were made of it. The Aztecs honored gods of maize and timed their lives to its planting and harvest. But the most important thing these civilizations discovered was not how to worship corn. It was how to make it truly nourishing. They soaked the dried kernels in water mixed with ash or lime, a kind of alkali. This process, which we now call nixtamalization, softened the tough skins and transformed the grain. Crucially, it unlocked a vitamin called niacin, which is otherwise trapped inside corn in a form the body cannot absorb. It freed up protein, and it turned the kernels into a soft dough, the masa that became the tortilla. Without this step, a diet built on corn slowly robs the body of niacin. With it, corn can feed an empire. The indigenous peoples paired it with beans and squash, the famous three sisters, planted together so each helped the others grow. It was a complete and brilliant food system, refined over thousands of years. Then, in 1492, everything changed. When Columbus reached the Americas, he found fields of a grain Europeans had never seen. Among the things carried back across the Atlantic was maize, and it spread across the Old World with astonishing speed. Within a century or two, corn was growing in Africa, the Middle East, India, China, and southern Europe. It was hardy, it grew fast, and it produced more food per field than almost anything else. In many places, it became a vital new staple, and it helped fuel waves of population growth. In northern Italy, it became polenta. In parts of Africa, it became the daily bread of millions. But the Old World took the plant and left the most important part behind. They learned how to grow corn. They never learned how to prepare it. No one outside the Americas knew about nixtamalization, that simple treatment with ash or lime. And so, wherever poor people came to depend on corn and little else, a plague followed. The first pellagra epidemic swept through northern Italy, Spain, and Egypt. And in the early 1900s, it exploded across the American South. It struck hardest where people were poorest, where families lived on cheap cornmeal, a little fatback, and molasses, and not much else. This was not a coincidence. Corn had long been the cheap fuel of the plantation world. Enslaved people had been fed corn rations because it was the cheapest way to keep a labor force alive. After slavery, poor sharecroppers, both black and white, ate much the same diet. A doctor named Joseph Goldberger was sent to investigate, and he proved that pellagra was caused by a poor diet, not by any germ. To silence the doubters, he and his volunteers even swallowed the bodily fluids of pellagra patients to show that the disease was not contagious. They did not get sick. But his findings were resisted for years. Admitting that pellagra came from diet meant admitting that poverty and a broken food system were killing Americans by the thousand. A sacred grain, stripped of the indigenous wisdom that made it safe, had become a disease of poverty. This decision, to take the crop but throw away the knowledge, seemed like nothing at the time. It was not. If you are enjoying this hidden history, take a moment to subscribe. Every week we uncover the extraordinary stories behind ordinary food, and the biggest transformation in this one is still to come. Because in the 20th century, corn was about to be reinvented on a scale no Maya farmer could have imagined. For most of its history, corn was grown the way all crops were grown, with farmers saving the best seed from each harvest to plant the next year. Then, in the 1930s, an American named Henry Wallace helped unleash a revolution. Scientists discovered that by carefully crossing different inbred lines of corn, they could create hybrid seed with explosive vigor. The new hybrid corn produced far more grain per acre than anything before it. Wallace founded a company that became Pioneer Hybrid, and hybrid seed swept across the country. Within a single generation, American corn yields multiplied several times over. But there was a catch built into the miracle. Hybrid seed does not breed true. If a farmer saved and replanted it, the next crop would be a disappointing jumble. So farmers had to buy fresh seed every single year, tying them forever to the seed companies. Combined with tractors and later with synthetic fertilizer, hybrid corn made the grain almost unimaginably cheap and abundant. And once a country produces a mountain of cheap corn, it has to find something to do with all of it. The government encouraged farmers to plant as much as possible. One agriculture secretary famously told them to get big or get out. Farms swelled into vast seas of a single crop, and the harvest kept growing. Engineers learned to break the corn kernel down into its parts through a process called wet milling. Out came cornstarch, corn oil, and a whole pharmacy of industrial ingredients. And in the 1970s came the invention that would change the modern diet: high-fructose corn syrup. It was sweet. It was cheaper than sugar, and it could be pumped into almost anything. Within a decade, it had flooded into soft drinks, breads, sauces, and snacks across the country. Corn was also poured into car fuel in the form of ethanol blended into gasoline. The grain that had once been worshipped as a god was now an industrial raw material. Here is something that surprises most people. The majority of the corn grown in the United States never reaches anyone's plate as corn. Most of it is fed to cattle, pigs, and chickens, or turned into ethanol for fuel. The rest is broken down into ingredients hiding inside thousands of products on the supermarket shelf. Corn syrup, cornstarch, corn oil, dextrose, maltodextrin, and dozens of others. Scientists who measure the chemistry of our bodies have found something strange. A huge share of the modern American diet can be traced back through animals and processed food to a single plant. In a very real sense, we are made of corn. It is in the soda, the cereal, the chicken nugget, and the steak. The wholesome image of corn on the cob hides an empire of invisible ingredients. But that flood of cheap corn came with a cost the system did not advertise. The high-fructose corn syrup that sweetened everything has been tied by researchers to the modern rise in obesity and type 2 diabetes. The endless fields of identical corn have pushed out other crops and shrunk the variety of what farmers grow. The synthetic fertilizer that feeds those fields washes off the land and down the Mississippi River. It pours into the Gulf of Mexico, where it feeds enormous blooms of algae that suck the oxygen out of the water. Each summer, this creates a dead zone, an area of sea where almost nothing can live, sometimes the size of a small state. A system built to grow as much corn as cheaply as possible has reshaped the land, the water, and our own health. And it has left much of the food supply leaning on a single, heavily engineered crop. So consider the corn in your life right now. It is the most produced grain on the entire planet. Farmers grow more than 1 billion tons of it every year, more than wheat or rice. The United States grows more of it than any other country. It is in your tortilla and your cornflakes, but also in your soda, your salad dressing, your meat, and your fuel tank. And the plant itself remains exactly what those ancient farmers made it. A grain that cannot reproduce without us, remade by hand from a wild grass. It was worshipped as a god, blamed for a plague, and finally turned into the cheapest calories in human history. The next time you bite into something sweet or salty or fried, remember that you are very likely tasting corn, even when you cannot see it. Inside this ordinary kernel is a history of gods, of plagues, and of an empire built on cheap calories. Corn was never just corn. If this story changed the way you see the food on your plate, subscribe for more hidden histories behind the things we eat every day. And tell me in the comments which part surprised you the most. Next time, the history of beef, the meat that built nations, emptied the Great Plains, and is now reshaping the planet itself. Until then, remember, there is always a hidden history behind the ordinary things.